Welcome back, you filthy exiles. So we now know the Affliction League won't be making it to the core game, but why is this okay? Well, firstly, the Affliction League was a good league and allowed for a lot of people to recruit currency really quickly, though this is not necessarily good for the game's economy. If we compare the price of Divine Orbs between the Ancestor League and the current Affliction League, we can actually see a trend of hyperinflation occurring from around the mid-league stage in Affliction League, which explains why the prices of items went absolutely ballistic at about that point. This is not sustainable for players that might pick up the trade league halfway through. They might have a late league start, they might have been away for work or something like that, and it's not really conducive to a positive play environment, which is why unstable economies in games like Path of Exile are not ideal. It essentially prices new players out of the market. Though that being said, there were plenty of ways to access currency through the Wildwood mechanic if you could understand it and could exploit it well enough. As it stands, I don't think we'll be getting a league similar to 3.23 in the 3.24 league from an ease of access to currency standpoint, or from a Magic Find standpoint, so it's likely that this is going to upset a lot of players. I would say that as a result, the quality of life changes we are currently seeing in the updates on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, and the adjustments to the vision as what I can see here the result of these updates being provided and what we'll be seeing over the coming weeks, is actually a way that they're trying to mitigate the sting from the damage that may be caused from taking away Magic Find in the game to avoid player-based lashback. So they're a bit of a smoke and mirrors sort of approach to take one thing away but give you something else. Am I negative to that? No. I think it's actually a pretty good strategy considering they've got huge announcements coming out for PoE 2, and they definitely don't want community lashback right before they're about to announce their second iteration of the game coming out. So this isn't a bad way to mitigate that outcome from occurring. However, this is just me speculating, and maybe it's not the case. We might be getting some really awesome currency generation mechanics in the next league. Not entirely sure about that, but we'll see what happens in the coming weeks. Also, that being said, bring on the quality of life changes. Not negative to that at all. I think it's great. I'm not a fan of Magic Find at the end of the day. So I don't necessarily think we should be concerned by it being removed. So I think it's actually a fair trade. I think we get one thing in trade of something else that was, quite frankly, more or less out of control. Okay, so now for the good stuff. Quality of life changes that we know of so far. So far we know that we're going to be getting unlocked masters on maps, so being Nico, June, Einhard, and Elva. And this will allow us to farm Delve Temple or Atsuatl Temple, Syndicate, and Bestiaries simultaneously, so we can switch between those mechanics as opposed to how it was before, where we'd go to the map device, have to tick it on and off, and we couldn't cross over those mechanics. So the big question here is, how is this change going to change my master missions, how they accrue, as you generally atlas and map up? So I reckon there's going to be some changes around that. Will this make different content more accessible or less accessible? This is soon to be seen, not sure. I suspect we'll see some major atlas mapping changes as well as a result of this too. This also corroborates with some of the commentary that we've seen in the PoE 2 interviews, which was where they wanted to really place mechanics in a position where the player would be forced to pursue that mechanic in order to get that particular outcome or crafting outcome. And so this very much falls in line with the methodology that they were speaking to around how they're approaching PoE 2. So they're echoing that methodology back into PoE 1 already from what we can see. Now, as far as the next one that we've seen so far is a change to Veiled Chaos Orbs, and also making them drop and or be target farmable from Katarina from Syndicate encounters. Based on the trailer from Necropolis, we can see that there are some bosses, one of which is Katarina. I reckon that we're going to see Katarina be potentially elevated to a pinnacle boss, and we're going to be going back to a bit of storyline, going back to Zana and some things like that have sort of been sitting around, and potentially Katarina and maybe a few of the other bosses from some of the other encounters, maybe Delve even, because they've mentioned it for once, could become a differential pinnacle boss and or might be elevated to new Ubers, though there were other corroborating comments that stated that the developers sort of think Ubers weren't the best decision, so I'm also mindful of that. The outcome of that is there could be new drops coming as well in this league. There likely will be, and as a result of that, these bosses may drop those drops. The other thing is we may see items like the Devouring Diadem change as well. if it's going to be a lot more of a impactful fight, it's potentially going to result in devouring diadem, as just one example, being a chase unique like a headhunter or something like that moving forwards. But that's sooner been seen. It'd be really cool though if that was the case, and that would potentially open up some changes to builds if it was impactful enough. My only comment for flasks being corruptible is it's just awesome. Don't think there's anything more to say about that. Crafts to move amulets to talismans, and changing that to a bestiary crafting ability is actually simply just a push to get players to play more bestiary. I would assume that there's not the biggest player base playing beast crafting and or bestiary, though I might be wrong in that respect, though it's not like a heavily advocated for strategy. Breach auto triggers also makes content more accessible to volume. So moving back a few leagues, there was a nerf to the drop rate of breach splinters, or the quantity of splinters dropped, which pretty heavily nerfed the breach mechanic. And as a result of that, things like, or items like the surrender and the skin of the lords actually skyrocketed in cost because it wasn't profitable and or feasible to farm breach. And it just became an absolutely painful ordeal to farm that piece of mechanic. Changes to the use of currency items like fuses, allowing you to right click and to hold and for it to just craft in. Potentially, I suspect this might also apply to things like chance orbs, for example. So it might actually make chancing, base types and things like that easier, which, you could get mage bloods or headhunters from doing that, or other different items like squires. So maybe chance crafting might actually get a buff this league, which would be really cool. As far as simplifying access to Pantheon powers for characters and having them a global interaction, this is basically their way of reducing player grind. So we don't have to go and find those Pantheon powers on every single character that you run. And I do that many times a league. That being said, it's unlikely that we'll ever see them take away the need for players to progress through the campaign. They've made that very clear they don't want to do that. I'm on the bench about it. It can work. I don't think it works well in Diablo 4. Last Epoch does it a little bit differently with the arenas. That being said, I think after playing so many characters and so many hours in PoE, it doesn't really bother me anymore these days. But, it would be good if there was a bit of an elevation to being able to make it quicker. But at the end of the day, I always looked at, if your character progresses through the campaign and they're mapping, you get a good idea and feel for the build that you're playing, as opposed to just blasting it for 2 hours like you used to do in adventure mode in Diablo 3. Getting to endgame and realizing you've got a really bad character. So, you can pick that up early on and course correct and things like that. Now, as far as the changes further to globalizing more content, I actually don't know what more they could do outside of that, because they've already done that with Lab, they've already done it with Atlas progression, things like that. I can't really think of anything else on a character that would need to be a global stat and or globally accessible outside of the Pantheon trees at this point. So at this stage, what we're seeing is a pretty, reasonable response to player feedback, more so than ever in the past, and potentially a path where PoE 1 becomes more accessible to newer players. What we can hope for now is better balancing across skills in the game to make it more equal in footing. What I mean by that, which is the biggest one that comes up with this conversation, is melee versus spellcasting versus minions. It would be really good if they could provide a bit of a prop up to melee to make it on par with spellcasting, and also minions. Bring minions back and send them back to where they were previously in earlier leagues when minions were a powerful choice. In particular right now, SRS tends to be just the most played minion out there. It'd be nice to see, zombie mancers and everything come back into the fray as a more reasonable option and a more consistent option. They're just, there are builds out there, but to min-max them at that higher end costs way too much for the average player. And realistically, the direction that PoE needs to go in, and I hope this is the direction taken with PoE 2, is making it more accessible and more balanced across the board for all players, whether or not you're a hardcore living in a dungeon player versus, you've come home from a 15-hour day at work and or you got a family player. There should be a balance between the two to make it more accessible without taking away the complexity of the game, but there needs to be a little bit of work done in consideration for that, because right now PoE 1 is very stacked in the way that spellcasters just outperform every other build in the game. And so why would you play you know, a Earth Shatter build or a Ground Slam build when slams have been nerfed into the ground. You really can't play melee in the game outside of like Bone Shatter, Shield Crush, and a few other iterations of that, which is disappointing because a lot of us really enjoy melee gameplay. So yeah. That being said, PoE 2 looks fantastic in that front, so they definitely made some fantastic changes there. But PoE 1, there needs to be a bit of thought behind that. They can't just leave that and let it go because PoE 2 is coming out. Either way, fingers crossed we see even more changes come out day by day, and some really interesting stuff that maybe they're responding to the community on for the first time that we've seen in, what, 11 years? Or in the best part of the last 6 years. So it's good to see them finally responding and changing the way that they look at the game from their vision standpoint. Anyway, if you like this video, don't forget to like and sub. Don't forget to follow the Twitch. And until next time, I'll see you guys later.